Please be seated. In Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives, sits the Chapel of the Ascension, on the place where Jesus is supposed to have last stood on earth. And attached to that chapel is an Islamic mosque. And somewhere below them is a burial crypt where a Jewish prophet, a Christian saint, and an Islamic mystic are all said to be buried. And all three of them are women. Huldah is the Jewish prophet, Pelagia is the Christian saint, and Rabia is the Sufi mystic. Huldah appears briefly in the Book of Kings during a time when the kingdoms of Judah and Israel were deep in crisis. It was the late 7th century before the Common Era, and King Josiah was doing some renovations of the temple and discovered some Torah scrolls that had been hidden in the wall. Now, these scrolls, which are typically understood to be a version of the book of Deuteronomy, reinterpreted many of the laws found in Exodus and Leviticus and made it painfully clear just how far Josiah's kingdom had fallen from loving God with heart, soul, and mind, and had strayed from loving their neighbors as themselves. And it promised some very unpleasant consequences as a result of this. Well, the king was disturbed, as you might imagine, and wanted a prophet to take a look at this and give it a second read. And interestingly, he doesn't go to Jeremiah, who was around, probably fearing that Jeremiah was going to launch into one of his lengthy, "I told you so, you're just going to get more wrath" Jeremiads that he was so famous for. Instead, he goes to Huldah. But if he was hoping for a more favorable spin from her, he was sadly disappointed, because Huldah tersely says, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am going to bring disaster upon this place and its people according to everything written in the book the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and have vexed me with their deeds." In other words, they have not loved God or their neighbors as themselves, and Huldah tells them so. Fast forward 1,000 years or so, and it's the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, and there's a group of monks and their bishop out for a stroll in the town of Antioch. And they pass by the beautiful Margarita, a well-known actress and courtesan, who is intoxicatingly perfumed and wearing just enough to inflame the imagination into all sorts of smoldering thoughts. Well, the monks bloom red-faced and look away, but the bishop chastises them and says, "We should show as much devotion for and take as much loving care of our souls as this woman does of her body." Well, the next Sunday, Margarita shows up at the bishop's church and begins the process of converting to Christianity. She takes the name Pelagia at her baptism, turns over all of her earthly possessions to be distributed to widows and orphans and the poor of the city, frees all of her slaves, and begins living with a female deacon named Romana. Sometime later, she disappears and goes to Jerusalem, where she lives in a cell on the Mount of Olives, ministering to the people there, but passing as a male eunuch, demonstrating her deep love of God and her neighbors, but in a very non-traditional way. A few more centuries on, the early 8th century of the Common Era, and a child is born to a Muslim family in Basra. Rabia was the fourth daughter of a family so poor they had no oil to light even a single lamp or even a cloth to wrap her in. But one night the Prophet Muhammad appears to her father in a dream and says that Rabia was a favorite of the Lord and that she shall lead many Muslims to the right path. But when her father died, she goes into the desert and lives a life of semi-seclusion, becoming a model of the mutual love between God and God's creation. And people came from all over for her spiritual and her ethical guidance. She's perhaps best known for her clarity about not only how to love God, but for the really pure reasons for worshiping God. She said this, "O God, if I worship you because I fear hell, then burn me in hell. Don't worship God out of fear." She also said, "If I worship you because I desire paradise, then exclude me from paradise." Right? Don't worship God because you hope to get something out of it either. But she says, if I worship you, God, for yourself alone, then deny me not your eternal beauty. Now, granted, there very, very few facts actually adhere to any of these stories of Huldah or Pelagia or Rabia. But that doesn't mean there isn't powerful truth in them. I think it is significant that a fearless Jewish prophet and a transgressive Christian saint and a reclusive Muslim mystic are all believed to be eternally sharing the same ground where Jesus last stood on earth. That miraculously thin space where the eternal and the earthly, where the sacred and the profane meet and combine, and through a kind of sacred alchemy are transformed into a healing balm for all of creation. Jesus quotes the Torah in commanding us to love God with all our heart and soul and mind, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And indeed, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all say that we should love God and have compassion and love and respect for one another. These are not simply shared values, they are moral imperatives in all three faith traditions. Last week, I sat around a table here in town with Christian, Jewish, and Muslim friends and fellow faith leaders here in Brookline. It was our regular meeting, but it was far from usual because we spoke openly about the anguish and the fear and the frustration and the anger that many in our community are experiencing because of the crisis in Israel and Palestine. We spoke about the different ways that we and members of our communities see and understand and experience all that is happening. And we recognized how in times of crisis, the pressure to choose a side can become strident and toxic. We spoke honestly to one another. We listened deeply to one another. And there was no doubt in that room that we all loved God and that we had all come together to affirm and honor our shared humanity. And at the end, we prayed in Hebrew and in Arabic and in English that we should not despair, that we shall see life in each other, that we shall have mercy for each other, that we shall have pity on each other, and that we shall hope for each other. We also wrote a letter calling on everyone in all of our communities to stand together against hatred in all of its forms, to call out injustice whenever we see it, to listen with compassion to one another, to reach out in faith, and to work together towards a world where every life is valued equally. These days it might appear that common ground is impossible to find. But I assure you, common ground is always possible. It is always there. And Huldah and Pelagia and Rabia all point to it. Sometimes we do need to be fearless and speak truth to power like Huldah. At other times we may need to be more subtle and transgressive like Pelagia. And like Rabia, we always need to be aware of our own motives and guard against doing things that might look like the right thing, but because we are doing them for the wrong reasons, they're not really the right thing. But common ground can always be found by those who truly love God and who faithfully strive to love our neighbors as ourselves. Amen.